The winter wind cut across Europe like a blade sharpened by history. Snow drifted through ruined streets, across broken villages, and over thousands of weary soldiers who had already seen far more war than any lifetime should hold. It was late in the war, but no one, not the generals, not the leaders, not the men in the trenches, believed the struggle would end easily. The world had been grinding through the years of conflict, and even though the tide had shifted toward the Allies, one truth remained: victory was not yet secured, and the cost of every step forward continued to rise. Somewhere far from the freezing battlefields, in a warm but heavily guarded room in London, Winston Churchill stood over a large military map. His shoulders were tense, his expression sharp, and his cigar burned slowly between his fingers as smoke curled upward like a ghost of decisions yet to be made. Behind him, the room remained silent except for the hum of distant war reports and the steady ticking of a clock that seemed louder than normal. Time was not just passing, it was judging. Churchill read message after message that arrived from across the channel. The reports were troubling, concerning, and in some cases, dire. They told a story of German forces that had launched a desperate, unexpected counter-offensive through the Ardennes, the very battlefield many had believed impossible for large-scale mechanized movement. But impossible was a word the war had crushed many times before. German units surged forward with surprising strength, cutting through American lines and attempting to split Allied forces. The situation was volatile. Soldiers were outnumbered, supplies were stretched thin, and communication lines were strained. The winter weather compounded the difficulty. Roads froze, visibility dropped, and movement slowed to a crawl. It wasn't just a battle, it was a test of resolve. Churchill leaned closer to the table as another message arrived. Read aloud quietly by an aide. American forces surrounded, holding position, requesting support. There was no panic in those words, only strength and defiance. But Churchill understood what they really meant. They were running out of time. Behind Churchill stood British military officials, advisors, intelligence officers, and high-ranking generals. Some were confident, some deeply worried, and some were silent, not because they lacked thoughts, but because they knew this moment mattered more than conversation. Finally, Churchill broke the silence. His voice was calm, slow, and weighted. War is not merely the clash of armies, he said. It is the test of leadership, will, and the human spirit. He lowered his head slightly, not in defeat, but in contemplation. Around the world, ordinary people hoped the fighting would end soon. Families feared telegrams. Children prayed for the return of fathers and brothers. Even hardened generals felt the fatigue of years of relentless battle. And yet, at the center of chaos, there were still those who refused to bend. One of those men was General George S. Patton. Churchill had heard of him long before this moment. Stories traveled quickly, stories of speed, precision, aggression, and results. Patton was unlike any other commander. He demanded excellence, he valued discipline, and he believed that hesitation was more dangerous than risk. The world knew Patton for his boldness, but those who studied him understood his deeper secret. He never moved without a plan and never hesitated once he chose a direction. As reports of the German offensive continued, Churchill finally asked a simple question, one that would alter the tone of the room. "Where is General Patton?" An officer immediately opened a folder filled with movement reports. "Sir," he said, "Patton is already repositioning his army. He is planning to turn north to counter the German advance." Churchill raised his eyebrows, not in surprise, but in recognition. It was exactly what he expected. But someone else in the room was skeptical. A British general cleared his throat and spoke carefully. "Prime Minister, respectfully, Patton cannot turn an entire army so quickly. The roads are frozen. Supplies are stretched thin. The weather." Churchill lifted a hand, not harshly, impatiently, but decisively. Then he asked, "Did Patton himself say he cannot do it?" The officer shook his head. "No, sir," he said. The man paused, checking his notes. "He said he could move within 48 hours. The room reacted, some with disbelief, some with quiet admiration. 48 hours. To turn tens of thousands of soldiers, to reposition armor, to coordinate artillery, to reroute supply lines, to reorganize communication. It was, by every traditional military measure, unthinkable. But Churchill did not smile. He simply nodded as if the universe had confirmed what he already believed. Then, after a moment of heavy silence, he spoke again. History is shaped not by what appears possible, but by those who act when others hesitate. Outside, the winter wind continued its chilling whisper, and distant artillery still echoed across Europe. But for the first time since the new German offensive began, the mood in the room shifted, not because the problem disappeared, but because a solution was moving, a fast one. Meanwhile, far from London, across frozen roads and through blinding snowfall, Patton's army did something astonishing. Trucks rumbled forward, tanks groaned through ice and snow, infantry marched relentlessly, their breath turning to frost in the bitter wind. Some soldiers wondered how such a massive maneuver had been ordered so quickly. Others simply followed because they believed in their commander. Patton rode near the front not in comfort, but in the cold with his men. His uniform was dusted with snow. His famous ivory-handled pistols rested at his side, not symbols of violence, but symbols of readiness. He spoke little during the movement. He didn't need to. His leadership wasn't built on loud speeches. It was built on presence. Hours passed, then more. The cold deepened, but the army did not slow not once. Because this was not just movement. This was momentum. Back in London, another update arrived. Patton approaching engagement range, preparing to support surrounded units. Churchill exhaled slowly, as if releasing the weight of the entire war from his lungs. And then, in a quiet voice, soft, but full of conviction, he said, "There are moments in war when a single action decides, more than strategy or numbers. This is such a moment." Another advisor asked, "Sir, do you believe Patton will succeed?" Churchill turned to him, not stern, but resolute. "I do not merely believe," he said. "I expect it." By nightfall, Patton's forces had nearly reached the critical point. The stars above were sharp and cold. Snow covered the earth like an unmarked gravestone. The world felt paused, waiting. Inside the American lines holding Bastogne, soldiers could hear distant engines. At first, quietly, then louder, then unmistakable. Hope arrived not as a whisper, but as a roar. Back in London, Churchill finally set his cigar down and looked toward the window, overlooking the dark British sky. Then he spoke the words history would later record. "Give me great generals if you can, but give me Patton when the world needs turning." And that night, the world did turn. Not gradually, not politely, not quietly, but with the force of a man who refused to accept defeat as destiny. Night had just begun to fade, when the first distant sounds of engines echoed across the cold European countryside. The moon hung low, casting long silver shadows across frozen fields and silent farms now scarred by war. The world was exhausted, stretched thin by fear, hunger, and uncertainty, but something was stirring, something different, something powerful. It was Patton's army. Columns of tanks, jeeps, trucks, and artillery rolled endlessly across icy roads. Soldiers leaned against the cold metal armor of Sherman tanks, breath fogging the air. Some were tired, some were nervous, but every single one of them knew one thing. This wasn't just another movement. This was a race to rewrite history. Churchill watched the reports arriving hour by hour. Each update carried urgency. Each telegram sounded like thunder. "Patton is moving faster than any field army of this size ever recorded." That line hit Churchill like a revelation. He leaned back in his chair and slowly exhaled, almost in disbelief. For months, Europe had felt trapped, locked in a winter that was more than weather. It was fear, loss, and doubt frozen into the ground itself. The German offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, had shocked the world. Entire towns fell. Roads disappeared under snow and enemy control. American forces surrounded in Bastogne seemed destined for disaster. Yet here was Patton, defying every rule, every limitation, every expectation. Some called it reckless. Some called it impossible. But Churchill saw something else. Hope wearing boots, covered in mud, driving tanks through a storm. No one could deny it. The tide was turning, and not slowly, not cautiously, overnight. As Patton's troops pushed forward, the German high command scrambled. Reports flooded Berlin like cold rain. American armor sighted near Haufelies. Enemy infantry advancing faster than expected. Patton's forces appear to be repositioning far beyond projected capabilities. One German officer reportedly muttered under his breath, "No army should be able to move like this." Yet they are. Another said, "It is as if their tanks do not sleep." And someone else added quietly, "This General Patton, he fights the war as if time itself belongs to him." Churchill read that line later, and it stayed with him. Because time was exactly what the Allies didn't have. Every hour mattered. Every trail through the snow mattered. Every soldier holding the line mattered. And Patton understood that better than anyone. Back at Allied headquarters, tension filled the air. Maps covered entire walls. Red arrows showed German advances. Blue arrows traced the counterattack. Officers spoke quickly, pointing, arguing, debating. The room felt like a storm, alive, unpredictable, urgent. But Churchill remained calm. He knew history wasn't shaped by noise. It was shaped by decisions. He spoke softly to Eisenhower during a briefing. "Some battles are fought with bullets. Others are fought with belief." Patton appears to understand both. Eisenhower nodded, wordless, thoughtful. He had once questioned Patton's temper, his unpredictability, his rough edges, but there was no denying his brilliance now. Patton's army wasn't just moving, it was transforming the war. Meanwhile, on the battlefield, something remarkable was happening. Villagers peeked cautiously from shattered windows as American troops rolled past. Some waved, some cried, some simply stood frozen, unable to believe liberation could arrive so suddenly. After so much terror, a young Belgian boy ran alongside a convoy, trying to keep up, cheeks red from the cold. A sergeant sitting atop a passing tank spotted him and tossed down a chocolate bar. The boy stopped, staring at it in disbelief, as if it were treasure. Patton's men weren't just soldiers. They were the first sign of light breaking through a very dark season. On December 22nd, German forces sent a message to the surrounded troops in Bastogne. Surrender. It was simple, cold, confident. The Americans replied with one word, nuts. Churchill nearly laughed aloud when he heard it, not because it was humorous, but because it symbolized something greater: defiance, grit, refusal to break. Churchill whispered to himself, "That is the spirit of free men." And when Patton received news of the exchange, he reportedly smirked and said, "Hold on boys, we're coming." Those words radiated through the Allied ranks like fuel. Because leadership isn't just about command. Sometimes, it's about giving people a reason to believe they will survive. As Patton's forces continued pushing through the snow and chaos, the German offensive began to lose momentum. What had started as a bold, aggressive strike now faced resistance unlike anything predicted. Churchill received another intelligence report. Patton's tanks have reached the outskirts of Bastogne. For a long moment, he didn't speak. He simply looked at the document as if engraving the moment into memory. Then he stood, walked slowly to the large map on the wall, and placed his finger over Bastogne. Softly, almost reverently, he spoke. "This changes everything, because history is made in moments that seem small, but alter the future permanently." The day Patton reached Bastogne became one of those moments. Inside Bastogne, the exhausted defenders heard the sound of engines, American engines approaching through the distance. The noise started faint, then grew louder, deeper, fuller, like the heartbeat of freedom returning. Soldiers climbed from foxholes. Medics paused. Civilians held each other tightly, and when the first American armored vehicle finally appeared through the winter haze, cheers erupted, not as celebration, but as relief powerful enough to feel like oxygen. Some cried, some saluted, some simply placed their hands over their hearts. Because when hope leaves, its return feels like resurrection. When Churchill was officially informed that Bastogne had been reinforced and relief had succeeded, he responded with a sentence that would later be repeated in history books, speeches, and military studies for decades. Today, Patton has given the free world a victory larger than a battlefield. Then he paused, looked out the frost-covered window, and added quietly, "He has given them belief again." The newspapers would later celebrate the moment. The soldiers would remember it for the rest of their lives. The world would come to understand it as a turning point in World War II. But on that quiet night, with snow still falling gently over Europe and the battlefield slowly going silent, one thing became unmistakably clear. Patton didn't just move troops. He moved fate, and Churchill knew it. Because wars are not won by luck. They are won by leadership, by minds that see beyond fear, beyond limits, beyond what others say cannot be done. That night, with pen in hand and the war still raging, Churchill wrote a note for his next speech. Days passed, but the weight of what had happened did not fade. The snow still lay heavy across Europe, quiet, cold, untouched in some places, scarred in others. The war was not over yet, but something had shifted, something deep, something irreversible. The world now understood that momentum had changed hands. Where fear once dominated maps and military forecasts, resolve now pushed forward. Churchill continued studying the reports. Each page carried numbers, movements, logistics, objectives, yet behind every statistic stood thousands of lives, decisions, and sacrifices. He knew that wars were never just strategy or machinery. Wars were human stories. Every victory cost something: time, strength, and sometimes a price that could never be measured. And yet, in this brutal winter of war, one man's decision had changed everything. General George S. Patton. As word spread across the Allied world about Patton's success, reactions differed, but one theme echoed everywhere: respect. Not admiration of war, but admiration of determination. Officers in London raised eyebrows and murmured, "He did what no one thought possible." In Moscow, Soviet officers studied maps, attempting to understand the speed and coordination. In Washington, lawmakers and generals spoke his name with renewed seriousness. But perhaps the most meaningful reactions came from the ordinary soldiers, the ones knee-deep in snow, mud, exhaustion, and sacrifice. To them, Patton wasn't just a general. He was proof that leadership still mattered, that someone was thinking ahead, that someone refused to let them fall. One American infantryman, writing home to his family, described it best: "When the sky was gray and we thought no one was coming, we heard the rumble of tanks. It was like hearing the world say, 'You're not alone.'" Those words reached London. They reached Churchill, and for a moment, he closed his eyes and simply reflected. Because sometimes, victory is not a flag or a map or a signature. Sometimes victory is giving one tired soldier the strength to keep going. As the front line stabilized and German momentum faded, Churchill prepared a message for Parliament and for the world. He knew what needed to be said. He knew the weight of the moment. He knew history had turned a page. When he finally stood before the chamber, silence settled instantly. He looked across the room, faces tense, hopeful, exhausted by months of bad news. Then he spoke slowly, clearly, meaningfully. There are moments in the life of nations when courage must answer fear, when conviction must answer doubt, and when boldness must answer darkness. The chamber remained still, listening not to a politician, but to a witness of history. Churchill continued, "In these past days, General George Patton has not merely maneuvered machinery or formations. He has resurrected the spirit of resistance." Some nodded, some closed their eyes, absorbing the impact. Churchill was not praising war. He was praising perseverance. His march to Bastogne, executed in conditions men described as impossible, has restored faith not only in victory, but in the belief that freedom will endure. Those words were not ordinary. They were a turning point, a reminder that the war was not merely being fought, it was being won. Outside Parliament, life carried on ration lines, blackouts, uncertainty, yet something subtle had changed. People walked with a little more confidence. Families lit candles with a little more hope. And somewhere at a desk late at night, Churchill wrote the words that would later become part of history. Some generals follow battle, others chase it. But General Patton did something rarer. He outran doubt. When the sky was gray and we thought no one was coming, we heard the rumble of tanks. It was like hearing the world say, "You're not alone." Those words reached London. They reached Churchill, and for a moment, he closed his eyes and simply reflected. Because sometimes, victory is not a flag or a map or a signature. Sometimes victory is giving one tired soldier the strength to keep going. As the front line stabilized and German momentum faded, Churchill prepared a message for Parliament and for the world. He knew what needed to be said. He knew the weight of the moment. He knew history had turned a page. When he finally stood before the chamber, silence settled instantly. He looked across the room, faces tense, hopeful, exhausted by months of bad news. Then he spoke slowly, clearly, meaningfully. There are moments in the life of nations when courage must answer fear, when conviction must answer doubt, and when boldness must answer darkness. The chamber remained still, listening not to a politician, but to a witness of history. Churchill continued, "In these past days, General George Patton has not merely maneuvered machinery or formations. He has resurrected the spirit of resistance." Some nodded, some closed their eyes, absorbing the impact. Churchill was not praising war. He was praising perseverance. His march to Bastogne, executed in conditions men described as impossible, has restored faith not only in victory, but in the belief that freedom will endure. Those words were not ordinary. They were a turning point. A reminder that the war was not merely being fought, it was being won. Outside Parliament, life carried on ration lines, blackouts, uncertainty, yet something subtle had changed. People walked with a little more confidence. Families lit candles with a little more hope. And somewhere at a desk late at night, Churchill wrote the words that would later become part of history. Some generals follow battle, others chase it. But General Patton did something rarer. He outran doubt. Meanwhile, Patton himself was not celebrating. He rarely did. To him, victory was not final, only momentum. He visited wounded soldiers, shook hands, spoke to them not as a distant commander, but as someone who understood sacrifice. Some men tried to thank him. He would simply answer, "Save it for after the war. We're not done yet." His tone was direct, but beneath it was something deeper, responsibility. Because Patton never saw success as personal glory. He saw it as duty, a duty to the living, a duty to the fallen, a duty to history. As winter slowly loosened its grip and Allied forces advanced, the German command recognized the truth. The last offensive had failed, and among captured documents, intercepted communications, and fragmented reports, one line repeatedly surfaced, a line spoken quietly among German officers. Patton was the difference. Churchill read that assessment. A small smile touched his face, not of triumph over an enemy, but of recognition. Because great leaders know, matter what uniform they wear, are obvious even to their opponents. Spring finally arrived, skies clearer, roads freer. The thunder of artillery now moving east with purpose rather than desperation. And as Allied armies pushed forward toward victory, Churchill prepared one final reflection, something not for generals or governments, but for the world eventually healing from war. Standing before microphones, he spoke words that would echo through generations. Wars are not won by machines, nor by numbers, nor even by strategy alone. They are won by spirit, the spirit of those who refuse to surrender to darkness. He paused, letting silence strengthen the message. When doubt overshadowed hope, General Patton reminded the free world that courage still lives. Then, closing his speech with quiet reverence, he finished. History will remember the winter when the impossible was demanded, and a man rose and made it real. Time moved on. The war ended. Europe rebuilt. Decades passed. Statues were raised. Books were written. Films were made. Generations studied maps and timelines, strategies and outcomes. But some stories survive not because they are written, but because they are too powerful to forget. The winter when Patton moved an army faster than anyone believed possible. The relief of Bastogne. The moment Churchill realized the war had changed. These were not simply events. They were proof that leadership matters, belief matters, courage matters. Proof that sometimes one decision, one bold, impossible decision can alter the entire course of history. And so today, when people ask, what did Churchill say the day Patton changed the war overnight? The answer is not one sentence. It is an understanding, a moment, a truth. Churchill said through words spoken and unspoken that the world had witnessed something historic. Not just a military maneuver, not just a victory, but a reminder that when courage leads the way, impossible is only temporary.